I've talked before about the general process of building a monster in my game, but I have yet to get into the nitty-gritty of any specific part of the process. It's been almost a year, dear God, since my devlog on building a monster, so how about we go back to that well and focus on a specific part of that process. And what better place to start than with the code that makes it all work? I think it'll be fun. Okay, fine. Depending on who you ask, code isn't exactly the most sexy part of game development, but it's my personal comfort area, and I do think there's some interesting tidbits to glean from doing a deep dive. And at the end of the day, this is my video, and I can do what I please, so we're talking code. My name is Lance, aka Infinite Level, and I'm making a psychological horror game titled What Hides in Dreams, where death leaves scars. Get comfy, grab yourself a cookie because you deserve it, and let's talk about the code that makes up my monsters.
It's about to get real nerdy in here.
In Unreal Engine 5, code comes in two flavors. There's the blueprint visual scripting, which has you connecting blocks with wires to create game logic in an easy-to-follow way. And then there's the C++ code, which is your more traditional line-by-line coding and looks like this. This view has a tendency to frighten people. Maybe it frightens you, but I'm gonna blow your mind. This and this are basically the same thing. I mean, that's oversimplifying it, yes, but as far as you're concerned, they're extremely similar. It turns out, you always had the power in you to code, you just didn't know it. You can technically work in only one or the other, and I'm sure there's plenty of games out there that do exactly that. Heck, I made one. But the intent is that they work together, with C++ typically used as your base that is then built upon using blueprints. And wouldn't you know it, that's exactly how I use the two in my own game. The C++ code provides my monsters with a standard behavior that is utilized by every monster in the game, while the blueprints are used to implement character-specific mechanics such as this monster's ability to detect a player using special detectors scattered throughout the level. So as the monster's base behavior derives from the C++ code, it would make sense to begin there. In a nutshell, everything a monster should have is defined in the C++ code, beginning with a whole bunch of properties, function declarations, and the sight and hearing components. Those two are going to be important because, duh, a monster can't react to anything if it can't see or hear anything. Now you might look at this and think, hang on, shouldn't there be more than that? Where's the audio components? Where's the hitboxes? You're right. I was lazy and scared. And I'm so deep into this game now that I'm a little afraid of what will happen if I do go in and add those. We call this technical debt, and ideally you don't have it, but I have managed to skirt around this technical debt by maintaining a monster blueprint template which has the remaining components I need. It's not great, I'm aware. I can practically see the judgmental looks. You sounded like you were gonna come up with some excuse for this. Nope, no excuse. I'm just lazy. Let's move on. So outside of components, you also have a big long list of properties that I then expose in the blueprint editor, allowing me to customize an individual monster's stats. These include things like movement speed, the minimum amount of time a monster can be in a chasing state, what kinds of sound effects to use, how many searches a monster must do before transitioning from alert state to search state, and many other things. There's also a variety of what I think of as control properties, which adjust the monster's decision-making based on the values of these control properties. This can be things like knowing whether or not the player is exposed to light, whether the monster is currently ignoring sounds, or if the monster is dead. Several of these properties are single variables defined in what's known as a header file, which are then used in the CPP file, which is where much of the fun decision-making happens. All monster behavior is divided into several chunks of code called functions. These functions run the gamut. There are standard functions like begin, play, and tick, which dictate what to do when spawned and what to do every frame, respectively. After that, it's all stuff I invented myself. A few functions come together to make decisions about changing what state the monster is in, while another calculates a minimum distance from the player before a monster is allowed to register the player's presence, and yet another handles checking for nearby doors to open. These functions are utilized by every monster in the game, so I can go ahead and decide what they do in C++ code, and then call the function as needed both in C++ and blueprints if desired. There's also several functions that are not given logic in the C++ code, but instead are implemented in blueprints later on. Notable examples of these are receive on some state events, which are called whenever the monster changes state. I wanted every monster to have the ability to do something when transitioning states, but what that something could be can vary wildly across monsters. So you give them all the ability to use this function and then come up with the specifics on a per monster basis. So let's say you have a monster that needs to do something special whenever it first enters the alert state. Well, in the more general purpose update state code, there's a line that calls receive on enter alert state, which essentially tells the monster, hey, if you have anything you specifically do when you first enter alert state, you better do that now. As implied earlier, most of these functions can be called in blueprints as well, meaning I don't have to wait for the stars to align in the C++ code to make certain things happen. If, for instance, I want to skip the alert state and jump the monster straight to chase mode, I can just call update state and tell it to do exactly that in the blueprint portion of the monster logic. In case I feel like really freaking out the player by giving them no time to react. Or maybe I want it checking for a door to open a little earlier than usual, or teleporting the monster somewhere else. The point is, I tried my best to make monsters adhere to a certain standard while giving them the flexibility to do their own thing. Unique behaviors for each monster is a big selling point in my game, so naturally I tried to write code to facilitate those needs. All of my children are special after all and need a supportive base to work off of. That goes for monsters and little human children. Which some might say are the same thing. That's all the most interesting bits from the joyous world of C++ code, without getting into the minutia of it all. But before I move on to the blueprints, I should maybe talk about these states I've brought up a few times. The monsters of What Hides in Dreams are designed with 4 modes of operation: search, alert, chase, and custom. Hopefully you can intuit what the first 3 are, but in case you're a toddler who barely knows words, search is for when the monster is simply prowling around with no concrete idea of where the player is. Alert is for when the monster saw or heard the player and is now investigating the area the sight or sound came from. Chase, of course, is when the monster has confirmed the player's presence and is now running straight to their location. Now there are some nuances to each of these modes, so let's work our way through these. Search can be thought of as the monster's default state. It doesn't know where you are, but it's sure going to try to figure it out and will prowl around the area in search of you. Well, okay, that's not totally true. The monster technically does know the general area you're in, but with the exception of the wife monster whose whole shtick is knowing where you are at all times, the monster is a good sport and doesn't try to bum rush you. I instruct the monsters to always maintain a certain maximum distance from the player. Without this, it would become ridiculously easy to outrun the monster and never actually encounter it, and that's no fun at all. So I give the monster a little hint on the player's location and then let it decide on which specific spot to investigate from there. Alert then is when the monster has noticed your presence, either through hearing a sound you made or catching a glimpse of you. The monster will investigate the area where it knows the player and search that spot for some amount of time before it loudly proclaims, "Must have been my imagination," and goes back to the search state. It's a lot like search, honestly, except the searching and patrolling is kept within a certain area as opposed to being based on the player's current location. Chase is the most straightforward of these states. This is the bum rush mode. The monster runs to the player's location until it loses track of the player. I do specify a minimum chase timer so that it will chase for at least a small amount of time before returning to alert state, and this timer is reset whenever it hears the player make a sound or sees the player. Custom is the wild card. It can literally be anything. For one monster, that's taking a moment to pause and stare longingly at the player before resuming chase, while another monster will use custom state to hide in darkness until you find it. Unlike the other states, no custom functionality is defined via C++. If it's a custom routine, it must be specified somewhere in the monster blueprint. All these states are brought together into what's known in Unreal Engine as a behavior tree, where I dictate an order of tasks to perform in a given state, and essentially switch between these lists of tasks depending on which state the monster is in. All these little purple blocks you see here represent some task to do, with the monster going through each task from left to right, and these tasks are grouped together under the state that they are for. Laid out like this makes the process look pretty simple, and there's a good reason for that. It is. I'm not making a xenomorph here. My monsters are relatively simple, but with just enough tools to pose a threat to the player, something I think this behavior tree here visualizes relatively well. We can now finally move beyond the C++ code and the state and behavior trees and enter blueprints, where monsters can vary wildly. I'm still going to try to summarize the main points of a monster blueprint, but as each monster in my game is meant to be pretty unique, it's gonna be tough to dig into the specifics without just getting into the guts of every monster in the game, and I'd rather not spoil such an integral part of What Hides in Dreams before it releases, so let's just focus on the surface level stuff. Very basically, there are 3 goals, because it's always 3, that the monster blueprint achieves: implementing monster-specific actions, running events for when the monster dies, and communicating with the player. Oh yes, turns out the player and the monster were secretly in cahoots. Breaking those down as much as I can without turning this into a breakdown of every monster in the game, monster-specific actions runs the gamut and can be anything from this monster's intro cinematic all the way to this monster's special behavior of hiding in the dark. Monster death events are also handled in blueprints because a lot of monsters have some specifics to figure out when they die. Turns out, it's not as simple as keeling over and becoming not alive. There are certain objects in the world to update in response, communicating with the player and updating save data, and in one case, putting the player in an entirely different ending zone from the escape route, among a host of other things. Like I said, it really depends on the monster. Finally, there's communication with the player, which sounds really weird at first. Why is the monster and the player talking to each other at all? I mean, the player's not even into whatever this guy's thing is. Well, it's because of things like changing the current music track, updating the player's save data, and some other miscellaneous stuff. The player has no C++ code at all, fun fact, and that's because the player as we know it is a product of the Horror Engine, a template project I used to kickstart the development of my game, and Horror Engine did everything in blueprints, so I can't communicate with the player through C++ like I want to, and there's no way I was going to go about converting all the Horror Engine stuff to C++, though that would certainly make for an interesting project. So instead, I let the player and the monster communicate through the magical world of blueprints instead. And lastly, there's animation. Now hang on a minute, Lance, I hear you say. I thought this was a video about dumb nerd stuff. Brother, this is a game development channel, it's all dumb nerd stuff. But yes, believe it or not, there is some light coding involved in the animation side of things too. And that animation code is important for completing the monster. Unreal Engine has these nifty little things called animation blueprints, which is exactly what it sounds like. They're blueprints, but for animation. The simple explanation is that this is another blueprint which expands upon the monster behavior by tying certain functions to certain moments in a monster's animation, as well as defining the rules for when a monster changes to certain animations. Defining rules for animation changes is pretty easy, often just changing a variable that tells the animation blueprint, okay, play this animation now. This is also where I do any animation overrides, like the office workers turning their heads towards the player when the player is near them. Animation events, which is a task that's executed at certain points in an animation, are a little more interesting. Here, you can hook up many of the usual blueprint nodes to do some action. In a lot of cases, that's playing certain sound effects at certain points in an animation, but it can even be used to transition a monster into a new state, interact with another actor in the world, or, I don't know, tell a funny joke. I haven't actually implemented that last one yet, but maybe I'll do it now as a funny Easter egg. In the end, this still falls under the category of blueprints, and is probably the least connected to the base monster code written in C++, but it's a very specialized blueprint that completes a monster's behavior. Without it, our very good and handsome boys and girls here would simply be missing their personalities. In fact, they'd straight up be missing their animations. They'd just A-pose at you all day, which is scary, but not the kind of scary I'm going for. And that's that. Everything you ever wanted to know about the code powering my monsters. Not sure how much appeal this video is going to have on wider YouTube. Well, compared to my already unappealing videos, it seems. But screw it, this ain't my job. I can do what I want with this channel. But that said, if you did enjoy this video, then a like and subscribe is, of course, appreciated. And if my game looks or sounds interesting, then I recommend making your way over to Steam and wishlisting What Hides in Dreams. Link is in the description below. Thank you for watching, have yourself a pleasant day, and Oh shoot, I went this whole video without doing that stupid Lance's Tech Talk gag that I decided to make a recurring joke. Quick, Editor Lance, throw that in there! Ah, much better. Now the video feels complete. Okay, until next time, bye.